What begins as a simple trip to the grocery store takes an unexpected and unforgettable turn when an elderly woman makes a shocking, racist remark to a young black man. What happens next doesn't just silence the room, it forces everyone to confront the uncomfortable truth about bias and prejudice. An ordinary trip to the grocery store takes an unexpected turn when an elderly woman tells a young black man to go back to Africa. What he says next doesn't just silence the room, it changes everything. The grocery store was buzzing with the usual hum of daily errands. Shoppers moved through aisles, some lost in thought, others chatting quietly. It was a sunny afternoon in a small neighborhood in Cleveland, Ohio, where the familiar rhythm of life was about to be interrupted in the most shocking way. Near the produce section, an elderly woman, probably in her late 70s, stood, adjusting her glasses. She had an impatient air about her as she reached for a bag of apples, muttering under her breath. Her cardigan was worn, the silver in her hair pinned neatly, and she appeared unassuming. But what happened next was far from ordinary. A young black man, tall and dressed casually in a blue hoodie and jeans, walked up to the same stand, reaching for a bag of oranges. His name was Marcus Hill. He was calm, polite, and seemed to blend effortlessly into the store's rhythm. He was texting on his phone while balancing a basket of groceries when it happened. The elderly woman turned sharply, noticing Marcus's presence, and her expression shifted. It wasn't subtle. Her eyes narrowed, and her lips pursed tightly. "You people don't belong here," she said loudly enough for others nearby to hear. Marcus froze, his fingers still on his phone. When he looked up at her, she continued, her tone cutting. "Why don't you go back to Africa where you came from?" The air seemed to thicken. A couple of shoppers nearby stopped in their tracks. Some exchanged uncomfortable glances, while others pretended not to hear. The rhythm of the store halted, replaced by an awkward silence that stretched far too long. Marcus's initial reaction was shock. His brow furrowed, and for a moment, it seemed like he might respond immediately, but he didn't. Instead, he took a slow breath, his face unreadable, as though he was weighing every possible response. The elderly woman, still clutching her apples, remained unapologetic and firm. Around them, the crowd began to shift. A young mother quickly guided her child away from the scene, and an older man near the potatoes glanced nervously at Marcus, waiting to see what he would do. The silence felt suffocating. Marcus remained completely still, his hand gripping his grocery basket. The weight of the woman's words lingered, hanging in the air like a bad smell no one could escape. The elderly woman didn't back down. She stood defiant, as though she expected no response. She adjusted her cardigan with a huff, her chin lifted in challenge, daring Marcus to say something. A young employee, stacking bananas nearby, froze mid-madness, unsure whether to step in or stay out of it. The crowd didn't move closer, but no one left either. They were witnesses now, like it or not. Marcus glanced at the woman, his face calm but his eyes full of thought. 1,000 responses raced through his mind. He could lash out, yell, or storm off, but none of those felt right. Instead, he allowed himself a moment to breathe. He shifted the basket to his other hand, straightened his posture, and let the silence stretch. When his voice finally cut through the tension, it was calm and deliberate. "Mom," he began, his tone steady, "do you even realize what you just said?" It wasn't an accusatory question, but a reflective one, as if he were giving her a chance to consider the weight of her words. But she didn't seem interested in reflection. "I said what I said," she snapped, her voice rising. "This is my country. People like you don't belong here." That was it. A young woman near the bread aisle gasped audibly, and the quiet murmur of the crowd grew louder. Yet Marcus remained steady. He didn't raise his voice, nor did he take a step closer. Instead, he allowed the silence to deepen, letting her words sink in, settling into the ears of those around them. "All right," he said finally, nodding slowly. His calmness was disarming, almost like a force of nature. "Let's talk about that, since you brought it up." The room held its breath, waiting for his response. The tension was almost suffocating. But what came next wasn't what anyone expected. Marcus shifted his weight and set his basket down on the floor with deliberate care. His calmness felt like gravity, pulling everyone closer, even those pretending not to listen. He fixed his gaze on the elderly woman, his gaze not filled with anger but with quiet, unwavering determination. The air in the store had changed. Marcus Hill stood steady, his eyes still locked on the elderly woman in front of him, her words hanging heavily in the air. He had let the tension settle, his composure unshaken as he gathered his thoughts. The room was now quieter than before, everyone holding their breath, waiting for what would happen next. "You said I don't belong here," Marcus began again, his voice steady but strong. "Let me tell you about where I come from." Each word he spoke felt like it had weight, each one carefully chosen. "My great-grandfather," he said, his voice unwavering. "He was born in Mississippi, and he worked the land as a sharecropper. He worked the land he didn't own, breaking his back just so his kids could have a better life. His father was a slave, kidnapped, beaten, sold like property. And for what? To help build the very country you're standing in right now." The elderly woman's face tightened, but she remained silent. The crowd around them seemed to freeze, absorbing every word. A man in the dairy section stopped, glancing at his phone. An older couple, their faces serious, exchanged glances but didn't turn away. "My grandfather," Marcus continued, his voice growing more resolute, "fought in World War II, fought for a country that sent him overseas to risk his life, only to come back and be treated like dirt. He couldn't sit at the same counters, couldn't drink from the same fountains, but he stayed. You know why?" The elderly woman had no answer. Her gaze remained cold, but she remained silent, seemingly waiting for him to finish. "Because he believed in this country's promise," Marcus said, his voice growing even firmer. "Even when it didn't believe in him. And my parents, they fought too, not with violence, but through hard work. Every day, raising me to believe in respect, kindness, and hard work." He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. His eyes remained on the woman, unflinching. "My mother's a teacher," he said, his voice calm but full of purpose. "She spent her life helping children, no matter their background. My father's a mechanic, the kind of man who would stop on the side of the road to help someone like you if your car broke down." "You're telling me I don't belong here?" he asked, his voice soft but unwavering. "That I should go back to Africa?" His eyes narrowed slightly and his voice took on a hint of sadness. "Ma'am, I am as much a part of this country as you are. My family paid the price for it. Blood, sweat, and tears." The woman's hands trembled, her grip tightening on the apples. She opened her mouth to speak but stopped, unable to find the words. Marcus took a step back, his composure unshaken. "I could have walked away," he said, addressing the entire store now, his voice calm but firm. "But what good would that do? Ignorance doesn't get better in silence. It's up to all of us to be better than this, to stand against words like those." The crowd remained silent, the weight of Marcus's words hanging in the air. The elderly woman's face, now flushed with a mixture of anger, embarrassment, and shame, glanced nervously around. No one came to her defense. A middle-aged man with a baseball cap stepped forward, his voice breaking the silence. "He's right," the man said, his words filled with conviction. "We have to be better than this." A murmur of agreement spread across the store. An older woman near the frozen food section nodded. "My father fought in that same war," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "He always said the only color that mattered was the red on the flag." A young cashier, no older than 20, spoke up from her station. "I've never seen anyone handle something like that with such grace," she said. "Thank you." The elderly woman, now visibly shaken, clutched her cart tightly. She didn't apologize, but the fire in her eyes had dimmed. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter, almost pleading. "I didn't mean—" She started but stopped herself mid-sentence. Marcus turned back to her, his expression softening but still firm. "It's not about what you meant," he said gently. "It's about how it came across. Words matter. Actions matter even more. A man from the deli counter clapped slowly, his hands unsure at first, but soon the applause spread. One by one, others joined in, the sound swelling into something undeniable. The elderly woman looked around, her face pale, and quietly wheeled her cart toward the exit. As she walked away, a few people moved closer to Marcus, offering words of thanks and support. One woman placed a hand on his shoulder. "Thank you for saying what needed to be said," she said, her voice full of gratitude. Marcus smiled faintly, lifting his basket back into his hand. "Sometimes," he said quietly, almost to himself, "it's not about winning or losing. It's about making sure people hear the truth." The crowd slowly began to disperse, the tension in the air replaced by a sense of reflection. Some were inspired, others deep in thought, but everyone seemed to have been changed in some way. The moment had passed, but the impact of Marcus's words lingered. The atmosphere in the grocery store felt different as people returned to their routines, but the truth was now impossible to ignore. The air felt quieter, more thoughtful. Marcus Hill finished his shopping, his steps measured, as if he were processing everything that had just happened. The weight of the moment hadn't shaken him, but it had left him reflective. At the checkout line, the young cashier who had spoken up earlier scanned his items with a shy smile. "What you said back there," she hesitated before continuing. "It meant a lot. People don't always stand up like that, especially with such grace." Marcus smiled back, his tone warm. "Sometimes grace is the only way to break through. Anger just builds walls." Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the parking lot. As Marcus walked to his car, he noticed the elderly woman sitting in hers, gripping the steering wheel tightly. For a moment, he thought about walking over to her, but decided against it. Some lessons take time to settle, and he had already said what needed to be said. Later that evening, Marcus sat with his father at the kitchen table, recounting the day's events. His father, a man of few words, listened intently, his hands folded on the table. "You did the right thing, son," his father said finally. "Not just for yourself, but for everyone who was watching. People like her, she might not change overnight, but you planted a seed. That's all you can do sometimes. Plant the seed and let it grow." Marcus nodded, his father's words resonating deeply. He realized that while the encounter had been uncomfortable, it was necessary. Ignorance doesn't change unless it's confronted, he thought, and silence only allows it to fester. Across town, the elderly woman sat at her dining table, staring at the untouched plate of food in front of her. Marcus's words replayed in her mind, each one cutting through the armor of her assumptions. She thought of her own grandchildren, of the world they were growing up in, and for the first time she felt a pang of something unfamiliar: doubt. In the days that followed, the story of what had happened at the grocery store spread through the neighborhood. People talked about Marcus's response, his courage, and the dignity with which he handled the situation. It became more than just an incident. It became a lesson, a reminder of the power of words and the importance of standing up for what's right. Marcus didn't seek attention for what he had done, but his actions rippled through the community in ways he hadn't expected. Strangers approached him with gratitude, sharing their own stories of prejudice and resilience. His quiet stand had sparked conversations that had long been avoided. The elderly woman, too, began to change. It wasn't immediate, but she started to question the beliefs she had held for so long. She didn't know if she'd ever see Marcus again, but if she did, she hoped she'd have the courage to apologize. Moments like these remind us of the power of kindness, strength, and truth in the face of ignorance. They teach us that standing up doesn't always mean shouting. It can mean speaking calmly, with conviction, and letting the truth do the rest. To everyone watching, let this be a reminder. Your words and actions matter. They can hurt or they can heal. They can divide or they can unite. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Together, we can spread messages of hope, courage, and understanding to create a better world.